Sunshine too, and temperatures still above average for the time of year, so still feeling pleasant. As we head into next week, more dry weather, more sunshine, but we'll see temperatures dip away, so some cold days and some cold nights ahead.
We'll see a cold snap, which will quickly develop into a warm front. Boxed Boiler Repairs, sponsors of weather on GB News.
It's the final week to see how you could be one of two big winners in our latest giveaway, as we have two prize bundles that have to be won. There's 2 lots of a totally tax-free £10,000 in cash. You'll also receive a brand new iPhone 16, along with £500 in shopping vouchers to spend at your favourite store. Hurry, lines close on the 7th of March. For another chance to win, text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message, or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus 1 standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2. Call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge, or post your name and number to GB11 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 7th of March. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Mornings don't have to be tiresome, especially if you have the right company.
Wake up to news as it happens, opinion and debate, and of course, a little bit of entertainment too.
Because when the kettle's on, we're on.
That's Breakfast on GB News, a show worth waking up for.
Every morning from 6 a.m.
Only on the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We'll spread the news, you spread the word.
Good Afternoon Britain isn't just about us. The wonderful thing about this programme is it's about everyone watching. It's an interactive programme.
Well, there absolutely is something to see here, and we're going to be talking about it more.
Whether it's breaking royal news,
Will, please bring us up to date.
or indeed a particularly punchy speech in the House of Commons,
Very, very curious.
we bring it to you live, and then we bring you live reaction as well.
That's Good Afternoon Britain, weekdays from midday.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camila Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation.
You haven't confirmed that you want to stand as leader, but you haven't ruled it out either.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial. Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
I deliver the dose of reality Westminster needs. That's the Camila Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and my show is your opportunity to cut through all the noise and dive in headfirst to some robust debates. Ideas clash.
Situation, isn't it?
Because
the failure is...
You're deliberately avoiding my point. Nothing's held back.
And if you think this is the end of it, wait for more.
And we do not shy away from the difficult stuff.
Sometimes I want to shake people and say, if only you understood.
So join me on Jubes & Kerr weeknights at 6 p.m, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, everybody. You're watching State of the Nation tonight on GB News with me, Matt Goodwin, the show that speaks up for you, the forgotten majority. On tonight's show, we have officially entered the era of two-tier Britain. New sentencing guidelines will make prison sentences less likely for ethnic and religious minorities. I'm going to be asking Ayaan Hirsi Ali and former Home Secretary Suella Braverman about this tonight. Meanwhile, as the international order continues to rest on a knife edge as the world awaits what will come of Donald Trump's Ukraine plan, I'm going to be joined tonight by best-selling author and Twitter Files publisher Michael Schellenberger. Plus, as the BBC extols the virtues of mass migration in the NHS, a truly bizarre story this week on the BBC website, I will be speaking to one man who knows more than most about this. He's not only revealed something deeply concerning within the NHS, he's not only a top surgeon, he also happens to be my uncle. That's State of the Nation tonight with me, Matt Goodwin, right here on GB News. A great show coming up. Now, I'll also be joined tonight by my top panel, contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and assistant comment editor at The Telegraph, Poppy Coburn. But first, it's time for the News Bulletin with Katie Bowen.
Matt, Thank you and good evening. These are your latest headlines. GB News understands this evening that 20 countries are in talks about joining a coalition of the willing to keep the peace in Ukraine. It was announced earlier today that the UK government has signed a £30 million deal to provide Ukraine's armed forces with more advanced attack drones to tackle Russian aggression in the Black Sea. Sir Keir Starmer said the UK will play a leading part in terms of defence and security. Posting on X after that EU leaders' summit in Brussels, President Zelensky said that, quote, everyone must ensure that Russia, the sole source of this war, accepts the need to end it. And tonight, EU leaders have agreed a statement in support of Ukraine without Hungary. And Ukraine's Zelensky says he is going to Saudi Arabia next Monday and will meet with the Saudi Crown Prince. We'll bring you more on this developing story as we get it. Well, that all comes as Defence Secretary John Healey has met with his US counterpart Pete Hegseth a short time ago. Earlier on, the White House said that they had made no decision at this time on the legal status for Ukrainians in the US. The Trump administration confirmed that they had stopped intelligence sharing with Ukraine last night. Triple killer Kyle Clifford has been found guilty at Cambridge Crown Court of raping his ex-partner Louise Hunt in an attack which saw him murder her and her sister with a crossbow and their mother with a butcher's knife. The 26-year-old was found guilty by a jury at Cambridge Crown Court after around 45 minutes. Clifford had previously denied rape. He previously admitted murdering Louise, Hannah and Carol Hunt at their home in Bushey in July last year. Clifford was tried in his absence after refusing to leave his cell at HMP Belmarsh. And just briefly, some breaking news this evening. President Donald Trump announced a short while ago that Mexican and Canadian goods will be exempted from the 25% tariffs that he imposed earlier this week. That exemption will last for a month. And the president has said that steel and aluminium tariffs will not be modified. We'll bring you more on that story as we get it. Those are the latest GB News headlines. Now let's go back to Matthew.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome back tonight to State of the Nation with me, Matt Goodwin, and welcome to Two-Tier Britain. Some of you may remember the Labour government's ruthless crackdown on the riots and disorder that followed the Southport attack last summer. It puzzled many people. How could it be that the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, the man who took the knee to the Black Lives Matter movement with his deputy Angela Rayner, just hours after the mob had pulled down the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol, just hours after that mob had harassed and assaulted police officers, how could he all of a sudden be a law and order Prime Minister? It didn't end with the crackdown on rioters. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, withheld information from the public regarding the terror charges of the Southport suspect, claiming if he hadn't, it could have prejudiced a trial, even though numerous cases emerged from the past where Keir Starmer had referred to other terror attacks as such within hours. Then it emerged in January that an internal Home Office report, get this, had described the idea of two-tier policing as a far-right extremist narrative. Well, the last 24 hours have turned the government's narrative completely upside down. Why? Because the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, Jonathan Hall KC, has claimed that it was a failure to disclose the facts about the Southport killer, Axel Ruda-Cabana, that risked prejudicing the trial. If the truth had come out earlier, there would never have been an information vacuum, he says. But it gets worse than that. Not only did the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, handle Southport catastrophically, but we now have definitive proof today that we are living in a two-tier society. The Sentencing Council, shockingly, has issued new guidance that would make prison sentences, get this, less likely for racial, sexual, ethnic and religious minorities. In a statement, the Council justified its effectively racist policy, and I'll call it what it is, it's a racist policy, on the grounds that there are disparities within the judicial system and therefore outcomes should be rectified in this manner. The Labour government has distanced itself from the guidance, with Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood saying that she completely disagrees with the guidance. But just this evening, the Times newspaper has reported that these guidelines were drawn up off the back of David Lammy's report from 2017. Shock horror. But the policy also stems from the most sacred of new Labour legislation, the Equality Act. So much that is wrong with Britain goes back to that piece of legislation. Labour may say that they want these rules scrapped. They may say they don't agree with two-tier sentencing, but they would never, ever dare touch the Equality Act. So look, what I'm saying tonight is as long as the Equality Act stays in place, as long as it remains unreformed, we are destined to become a two-tier country indefinitely. And that's something, of course, that nobody of sound mind in this country wants to see. As ever, let me know your views at gbnews.com/yoursay or tweet me. Meet me on X at GoodwinMJ. But I'm joined now by author and human rights activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who has been documenting what's happening in Western societies more closely than many other people. Thank you, Ayaan, for joining us. Now, many people out there tonight will be reading about this two-tier justice system, wondering how on earth any civilized society can allow this kind of imbalanced approach to justice to take place. And they'll be asking this central question, I think. How on earth has this happened, and what's behind it?
It's ideological. And I think that ages ago, when you had Jeremy Corbyn, he was very transparent about what he wanted to do and where he wanted to take the Labour Party. But there's this mind virus of wokeism that has infected the Labour Party. And with Keir Starmer and others, they were able to present themselves to voters as a safe pair of hands that can be trusted. And then meanwhile, use guidelines and guidances and these tricks to impose the theory of it's critical theory, critical race theory in this case, impose it on Britain. And it's absolutely wrong. I mean, it's taking a wrecking ball to the rule of law. It's going to destroy the trust between citizens and the government, or what's left of it. And it is going to destroy the trust between citizens across the board, between the groups that are mentioned in the sentencing guidance. So I think it should be stopped. And I agree with you. It's all in that Equality Act. And any serious party that wants to restore Britain to its rational, commonsensical justice system, where we are all equals, all equal before the law, they will have to start by repealing the Equality Act and by getting out of the ECHR and all of these add-ons to the system. I
mean, I've often made the argument, Ayaan, that if we're really to genuinely turn the tide in this country, we really need to begin by repealing much of the Blairite legislative legacy from the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s, the Equality Act, the Human Rights Act. Many of the problems we experience today, that we see today, go back to that new Labour government. The reality, looking at these sentencing guidelines, if people out there watching aren't clear as to what we're really talking about, what these guidelines essentially are saying is, look, if you belong to a racial, ethnic, sexual, gender minority, if you happen to be transgender or you come from an ethnic minority, we'll take that into consideration when deciding whether or not you go to prison. It is an intervention that wouldn't happen if, let's say, you are a white, straight Christian male. And people out there will be shaking their heads. And of course, I think for Keir Starmer, this is particularly problematic, given that, you know, Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper and the Labour government has spent the last 6 months branding anybody who discusses two-tier Britain as a far-right conspiracy theorist. The Home Office report even said this in January. If you talk about two-tier justice, you are part of what they described as a far-right extremist narrative. So it's a hypocrisy that I think is becoming unavoidable to many people.
It's a hypocrisy, but it's also the use of things like guidelines. It's not a bill through Parliament. It's not something that they campaigned on, because, of course, they know the majority of the population will say no to this. So it is an imposition on the citizens via these bureaucratic, you know, guidelines and rules and regulations, and then that is imposed, and anyone who tries to say anything about it, they'll have to deal with these guidelines. But I think it's also good for viewers to understand the theory behind it. This critical theory is a viewpoint that looks at society and only sees power dynamics and power relations between human beings. And I think part of it is exposing that and educating the public, and then opposing it. And I don't know, you know, where your other parties are. The Conservative Party, Reform Party should obviously come out against this and very strongly. But like I said...
Absolutely. And I think educating people out there, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, is exactly what we're trying to do with this debate and discussion. And I wish we had a lot more time for this discussion tonight. We're actually joined right now by Conservative MP and former Home Secretary Suella Braverman. Now, Suella, Ayaan Hirsi Ali there is saying that actually what we're looking at here is not so much a bad policy, but actually a bad theory, an intellectual assault on the system that is so deep-rooted. And let's be frank, it's been allowed to take root by both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party over the last 30 years, that we're now actually just seeing the effects of that theory bubble up to the surface. I mean, everyone out there will be shaking their heads saying, what on earth is happening to Britain? I know that's what I think when I read the newspapers every morning. So here's my question. How do we get rid of it?
Well, Ayaan is absolutely right. It's a total perversion of justice, equality and fairness that certain groups deserve more leniency in sentencing purely because of their identity, their ethnicity, their sex, their sexuality. That's a flagrant breach of natural justice. Your question is, how do we get rid of it? Well, I think other than the two-tier aspect, which is outrageous, disgraceful and a damning indictment of our justice system, which is a point of substance we really all need to explore much more fully, I think there is also an issue about democratic governance. And over the years, a lot of it was done under Blair, and unfortunately the Conservative government didn't get to grips and undo some of these damaging things. A lot of power which was originally residing within ministers and Parliament was dispersed and diluted to independent bodies and quangos. And the Sentencing Council is one such body. It's independent of government, although the Minister of Justice, Shehbaz Mahmood, can direct policy and influence their appointments and personnel. But ultimately, they do set the rules themselves. And you can see this throughout government. We outsource things to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, whether it's the Sentencing Council, whether it's the Office for Budget Responsibility, whether it's the Environment Agency. And there is huge amounts of power which has been dispersed outside the hands of elected politicians. Yeah. So
having said that,
apparatus of how we govern Britain needs to change.
Having said that, Suella Braverman, the reality in this case, it appears, is that actually these guidelines were signed off or implicitly endorsed by Labour politician David Lammy. Now, I don't think he said anything tonight. Shehbaz Mahmood, Labour are making it clear they don't agree with these guidelines. We just need to put that up there. But they were implicitly endorsed by David Lammy and sort of the identitarian left prior to Labour entering government. So where are they tonight? I mean, surely we should be hearing a rejection from David Lammy and others at the very top of the Labour Party.
Well, you're right. So there is this identity politics, virtue signalling, all of this kind of grievance politics, social engineering that is so replete within the left of British politics, and that's what's infected a lot of these institutions where a lot of power resides. But you're right. The things like the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act, those are pieces of legislation which have given rise to many of these practices and institutionalized them, and they've placed obligations which have perverted actually outcomes when it comes to justice. This is an incredibly chilling proposal. It is racist, as you say. It's racist against white people. It's sexist against men. And it's just a disgrace that our country has got to this point where institutions, arms of the state and ministers are sanctioning this kind of behaviour.
Well, I mean, the big concern here, I think perhaps one that you share, is that what we'll end up seeing if these policies are allowed to remain in place is a complete breakdown of public trust in the entire judicial legal system. Thank you, Suella Braverman, for joining us. Now, I'm joined by my top panel, contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and assistant comment editor at The Telegraph, Poppy Coburn. Michael, this is anti-white racism, isn't it?
Well, I think these new sentencing guidelines are wrong. I agree with the Labour Party and the Conservatives in saying that this was done in a hammer-fisted way. As to where David Lammy is, I mean, he was meeting the Indian Foreign Secretary, so I'm not sure if this is really his brief. I would also say this wasn't signed off by David Lammy. So the background to this is that numerous reports have shown that when it comes to sentencing, judges are more harsh on people of colour. Ethnic minorities. Now, that's not just to say because more ethnic minorities go to prison than white people, therefore racism. No. What studies show is that for the same crime, so for the same type of crime, if you are of an ethnic minority, you are more likely to get a prison sentence. Now, one thing that David Lammy brought up in his report is that I think maybe what the audience don't quite, or what hasn't been made clear, is that when it comes to sentencing by a judge, they take into account the background of everyone who comes before them. So do they think they have a productive future ahead of them? Did they have a difficult relationship with their family that made it more likely that they'd commit a crime? These are the kind of judgments that a judge is making every time they sentence someone. Now, you can say that shouldn't happen. We should just give everyone the same prison sentence depending on the crime they've done, and sort of the personal characteristics of the person should be irrelevant. But they're not. We do that for everyone. And one of the explanations for why black people are 20% more likely to go to prison when they have done the same crime is because judges are more likely to be white, they're more likely to be middle class, and so those background contextual factors, they're less likely to understand. So actually in Lamy's report, it was quite interesting. He wasn't just talking about race, he was talking about class. So he said one reason why pre-sentencing reports might be useful, and he never said that ethnic minority people should be more likely to get pre-sentencing reports. That's a bad policy, bad suggestion. I think it's a sort of blunt instrument. But he said that the more we use things like pre-sentencing reports, the more that can close the gap between the background of judges, both in terms of class and race, and the people who sit before them.
So, Poppy Coburn, we don't have anything to worry about.
I mean, I think this would have been a view that I would have had some sympathy for if it was told to me 20 years ago. But I don't think you can now argue that judges are acting in a way that is carrying the kind of old prejudices of the 20th century. I think what was interesting about the point on ideology here, is it a perversion of equality, or is it people trying to enforce equality in a way that they know how? The problem here is that as a society, we don't actually know how to accept disparate outcomes. We find them very uncomfortable, and so we try and look for a solution to it. That is why the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, I think we can agree that while they share views on some things, they are two distinct political entities, both came to the same conclusion about these sentencing guidelines. Now, where I dispute this is that I do not believe racial or sexual categories are correct guidelines to be looking from on high as a reason for why someone is committing a different crime. I don't think that's the way that justice should be done in this country. There is a difference between saying this person perhaps has a history of domestic abuse and this may have some mental effect on them, maybe they hit their head, this needs to be taken into account, to this person comes from a different ethnicity. That is a completely different consideration that should be nowhere near, in my opinion, judicial decision-making.
Yeah. I mean, Poppy's right, isn't she, in that we had the Sewell report, which obviously put out a different narrative to the, let's call it the sort of establishment narrative, that all disparities run back to institutional racism, and people like Tony Sewell were saying it's way more complicated. As Poppy said, people struggle to deal with disparities in a culture that's obsessed with diversity. But what do you think about that? Is that not...
Well, I think disparity analysis can be done in a crude way. You have to look at all the elements. Obviously, people should go to prison in proportion to the amount they do crime, right? It's not necessarily going to be the exact proportion of every different group in the country who, behaves in different ways, right? Culture matters. But the issue here is that the sentencing is more harsh for ethnic minorities when they've done the same crime. So if they've done the same crime...
Counter-example,
and they haven't...
Just in one case where race and ethnicity has been used in a concrete case of changing sentencing agreement. There was a case where a young girl, underage girl, was sexually assaulted in a grooming gang-type phenomenon. And because she came from an Asian British background, her perpetrator was given a harsher sentence because the judge specifically said, because she is not a white woman, because she is of Asian descent, this is going to affect her marriageability prospects in the future. Do you think that's acceptable?
No, not at all.
OK, we're in agreement. But then these sentencing guidelines shouldn't be in place, because this is
Well, I don't agree with these. So there's two things, isn't there? Should judges take things into account? Because what we often hear, I mean, the more common story sort of 5 years ago was you hear someone who's a student who's committed a crime and the judge says, OK, you've committed the crime, but I can see you've got a brilliant future ahead of you. And so they get a more lenient sentence. And I think what this was trying to remove was that.
Well, on that note, this debate is going to carry on for sure, and I look forward to hearing from David Lammy in the days to come when he isn't on a plane talking to another foreign minister. Thank you to my panel. After the break, as the international order rests on a knife edge in anticipation of Donald Trump's Ukraine deal, I'm going to be speaking to the best-selling author and publisher of the Twitter Files, Michael Schellenberger. You're going to want to stick around for this.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Good morning. Are you all right?
I am all right. All the better for seeing you, my friend.
John, you've been through so much. We've just heard there about you losing your wife and losing your daughter. I'm so sorry to hear about both of those things. And despite all of that and everything you've been through, you continue to just give back. How can you do that? Just take something so negative and turn it into something so positive?
Well, Sheffield is the finest city in England. That's what I think about the Sheffield people and everybody. 250,000 I set out. I beat that. I got that. Just what's got in bucket. So I thought, well, set go ports a bit, are you? So we were for 500. And we got that. And I thought, well, why not go say for $1 million? And we got the $1 million. This is what I think about my people of Sheffield. It's just entitled my city. Sheffield, my city, that will always be home to me, no matter where I go or whatever sights I will see. Whenever I return, church bells will peal as I come home to the city of steel. A cathedral, cinemas, museums, Sheffield has such beautiful places. Home to a host of people of so many races. Living and working in perfect harmony. That's why Sheffield is the greatest place to be. Singing the praises of Sheffield, Sheffield, my Sheffield, as I go forth. For now we are the sporting city of the north. Wonderful people, so happy, so helpful, so kind. Sheffield, no better place you will find.
GB News, the People's Channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel. And as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Join me, Nana Akua, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, Dave.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to State of the Nation on GB News Tonight with me, Matt Goodwin. Now, let's look at America, because CBS polling, brand new polling, has indicated that 76% of Americans approve of President Trump's address to Congress the other night, with strong support for his positions on government spending, immigration and foreign policy. Despite this, Democrats protested with some strange signs and clothing, and Al Green, one of the Democrat politicians, was even removed for heckling President Trump as he was speaking. Now, the high approval ratings raise some pretty big questions about whether the Democrats are actually out of touch with the American public right now, whether they are really out of touch with this new Trumpian zeitgeist sweeping through the country. Meanwhile, the president himself is busy cracking down on universities allowing what are called illegal protests in the United States, upsetting all of the usual suspects. To unpack all of this tonight, we're joined by best-selling author and publisher of The Twitter Files, not to mention Substacker. His Substack Public is essential reading. I read it every day. Michael Schellenberger. Michael, thank you for joining us tonight. So how's it going over there in the US? The Democrats, I watched Trump's address to Congress. They look to be completely adrift from where the average voter is in America.
Yeah, hey, Matt, it's great to be with you. Yeah, I mean, it's as though the Democrats deliberately cast themselves in the role of children against a kind of paternalistic Trump. The behaviors were tantamount to temper tantrums, you know, protesting before he had said anything. They had their cards written before he had spoken. And yet you still left the evening not sure what they were complaining about. The big three issues that Democrats had really waged culture war on were climate apocalypse, transgenderism, and racialized DEI programs. There was no mention of those. They were running away from those topics, and you can see why. 78% of Americans say they don't want biological males in female sports. 71% are against gender-affirming care. We've all seen what Britain has done in terms of phasing it out. We just saw Governor Gavin Newsom, one of the country's most high-profile Democrats of California, coming out against boys and men in women's and girls sports. So you see the Democrats really, their whole agenda, it's not just that they lost the elections, they really lost, I think, the moral high ground over the last several years, and that got cemented with a political victory that the public delivered to Trump. But I mean, it's straight out of Greek tragedy. I mean, the Democrats have made Trump into a world historical figure on par with other major figures of the past, who's ushering in not just a new government, but really a new world order.
I mean, I'm just interested looking at, all the things that Trump's doing, stripping out diversity, equity and inclusion, pushing back against woke ideology in the institutions, the tariffs, everything else. I mean, this is actually bigger than Trump, and it's bigger than America, isn't it? Are we not actually seeing a philosophical turn in the West? We're seeing a sort of repudiation of what we might call the liberal consensus, what we might call the sort of zeitgeist that dominated Western societies for much of the last 20 years. I mean, there's something bigger. I look at Germany, I look at Italy, I look at France, I even look here in Britain. We've got the rise of the Reform Party, #1 in the polls at the moment. There is something bigger going on here, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for years, I would sort of think it was a little cringe, this idea that we were headed towards a fourth turning. It seemed very new age, this idea that every 80 years since 1776, 1860, 1940, 2025, that there's some big epical shift. But of course, that's exactly what's occurring. The world is in a reversion back to, I think, a more natural state of national sovereignty. We had 80 years of very intense globalization that I think most people at this point think went too far with mass migration. We still view Europe as our siblings, as our equals. And, we descended from the European Enlightenment. We care about it. But I think we're ready to re-level our relationship. We're very tired in the United States of fighting foreign wars. It's not just Ukraine. I mean, it's the last 25 years of Middle Eastern wars. It's the last 80 years of being global police officer. It's not a natural place for us as Americans. We tend to be more isolationist culturally than people, I think, realize. We had to have a lot of propaganda for us to want to go to war in the First World War. The Second World War, it took Pearl Harbor. So I think we're coming to a place now where we feel like, look, Britain, France has a nuclear deterrent. They're offering that nuclear shield to Europe. Ukraine's going to have to shake out. Obviously, there's going to be some amount of tragedy no matter what, because it's great power politics. But I do think you're reverting to what potentially should be, if there's a positive transition, if it's done thoughtfully and rationally, I think a better relationship between the United States and its allies.
Michael, can I just ask you about what's going on among the elites in Western societies? Because, some would push back and say, well, actually, the Democrats, Labour politicians here in Britain, their counterparts across Europe, they're worried legitimately about the rise of what they would see or consider to be authoritarianism around the world. But I'm also struck, I mean, the arguments that other people have made, Andrew Sullivan, among others, that we're living through the greatest radicalization of the elite class since the 1960s, that something strange has happened among the sort of top 5%. And, you saw it with the reactions in Congress with the Democrats. They've gone so far to the cultural left that they almost just cannot meet voters anymore on the centre ground. They can't talk to them reasonably about immigration. They can't talk to them reasonably about sex and gender. They can't talk to them reasonably about the history of their nations without saying they're racist and they're terrible. I mean, just get your thoughts for a second. What has happened among the elites in politics in the West?
Yeah, I spot on. I absolutely agree. I mean, the idea was that the right had become radicalized. That's why people say the far right. That's why they equate nationalism with fascism or totalitarianism. In reality, the new right, the more nationalist right, has moderated from previous right-wing positions. In the United States, Trump famously criticized the Iraq invasion. He defended entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. They took abortion off the table, and they embraced things that the normies that are very moderate. Sports for women should be protected for women. We should not be operating on the bodies of children in an effort to change their gender or sex. Climate change is real, but it's not the end of the world, and we certainly can't power the world on renewables. So I do think that, I think the elites got very radicalized. I think it's a consequence of of a kind of decadence, a kind of prosperity, and civilization just worked really well. There wasn't a need for sort of strong leaders until the elites eroded the pillars of civilization so sufficiently that it did require these kind of lion-type figures, to borrow from Machiavelli, to push back against the foxes who had operated in the deep state to undermine democracy, to undermine free speech. And so I think where we've arrived is that the problem for the Democrats, and I think for much of the elite left in the Western world, is that they've got their base that's radicalized around a set of issues that are deeply unpopular with the majority of people. And so it's really probably going to take a powerful, disagreeable, strong leader from the left to take on the traditional labor left parties of the Western world in order to bring them back into some more competitive place. Until that happens, it looks like the right-wing majority will only grow stronger.
Well, absolutely. Michael Schellenberger, he is the writer to follow, to navigate these issues around the culture wars, particularly free speech and suppression. Thank you, Michael, for joining us. Now, in a moment, the National Trust, get this, is facing criticism for increasing its membership fees. But does going woke mean going broke? We're going to be talking to an expert on the National Trust in just a couple of minutes, because I want to know what on earth is going on.
Dinner under the stars tonight?
That reminds me of our travel insurance.
You mean all clear skies?
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations Forecast.
It's an unsettled story across some parts of Western Europe as we go through the next couple of days. There's the risk of some heavy, thundery rain bringing some flooding. There's a system pushing into Portugal, western Spain, and that's bringing some intense rain. Also, some heavy rain already affecting eastern parts of Spain, so further totals building up, causing more issues. More unsettled weather across parts of the Mediterranean, though further east towards Greece it's looking largely dry. Then quite a mixed bag when we head through the weekend.
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations Forecast.
Join me, Camila Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation.
You haven't confirmed that you want to stand as leader, but you haven't ruled it out either.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial. Is he indecisive? Incompetent? I deliver the dose of reality Westminster needs. That's the Camila Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
Aaron, this is a mad idea.
The future is bold. The future is hard, and it requires mad ideas, and we're proud to be bold and thought-provoking.
How are you going to make money out of this?
Well, the Olympics make $4.5 billion in revenue per Olympic cycle, and they're a wildly profitable organization that has never been challenged. So we're very proud to take them on and create something better and more efficient. It's not well known, but 44% of Olympians admit to using banned performance-enhancing substances, according to research funded by the International Olympic Committee and published in a top-tier scientific journal. It's absolutely rife. So 44% of elite athletes admit to using banned substances, only 1% get caught.
Would this not encourage the production of harder drugs, though? You know, steroids that go that bit further?
Absolutely. Right, and the goal is to create an environment where research and development are openly celebrated rather than being done in secret. When things are done in the open, we can study those compounds, and the drugs that allow athletes to run faster and jump higher are the same drugs that will allow all of us to be younger and faster and stronger for longer.
If, as you say, 44% of Olympians are actually using this stuff anyway, secretly behind the scenes in a sort of hidden and unregulated way, would it actually look that much different to you or I sitting in the stand watching people run 100 metres? Would they actually do it much faster?
Yeah, because you could have athletes who are in their 30s, maybe even in their 40s, breaking world records. And we're already seeing that with our athletes that we have in training. It's absolutely exceptional. If almost half of Olympians are already using banned substances, they're doing so in secret. They're not using the best available compounds. They're not doing it under clinical supervision. They're doing it to beat the drug testing, not to optimize their results.
The People's Channel.
Mornings don't have to be tiresome, especially if you have the right company.
Wake up to news as it happens, opinion and debate, and of course, a little bit of entertainment too.
Because when the kettle's on, we're on.
That's Breakfast on GB News, a show worth waking up for.
Every morning from 6 a.m.
Only on the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We'll spread the news, you spread the word.
Welcome back, everybody, to State of the Nation tonight with me, Matt Goodwin. Now, the National Trust is facing backlash after quietly hiking its membership fees by up to nearly 6%, with the annual adult pass now nearing £100. Critics, including Reform MP Rupert Lowe, argue that the rise is an unfair squeeze on loyal visitors, especially as many families are already tightening their belts during the worst cost of living crisis since the Second World War. Now, this move comes as the Trust also is grappling with declining membership numbers, partly due to its engagement with the woke agenda. Now, I'm joined tonight in the studio by senior researcher at the Prosperity Institute, Zudatu Gebrahonis. I should say that Zudatu works for the Prosperity Institute. The Prosperity Institute is funded by the Legatum Group, which is one of the lead investors in the holding company of GB News. That all said, Zudatu, what is going on with the National Trust? Because I think there are going to be lots of people out there reading these stories, going to National Trust properties, seeing all of the warnings and the guidance and the sort of anti-British vibe that now seems to permeate the National Trust. And like many other of our institutions, they're going to be asking, what on earth is going on?
There are lots of issues going on with the National Trust. I would say it's a particularly odd time for the National Trust to be hiking their membership prices yet again, because levels of dissatisfaction among members and volunteers is at a high. We've seen that membership numbers have declined over the past few years, and volunteer numbers have dropped under 40,000, which is the lowest in over a decade. So we're talking about very high levels of dissatisfaction with the current management and the direction in which they're taking the National Trust. An organisation which was set up to be preserving the nation's heritage, built and natural, and which has been overseeing in some ways a certain, managed decline, which is very sad.
And the managed decline, is it about governance, how the National Trust is governed, or is it actually about ideology? Because I go to National Trust properties and houses and, take family. But the last 10 years, I've just sort of found myself looking at a political project that seems to be sort of imposed on me from above without my say-so. It certainly doesn't seem to be always presenting the best image of Britain or indeed our culture. So, I mean, is it bad governance or is it ideology?
Well, I think ideology is a big part of the problem. From about 2017 onwards, in particular, the National Trust has been pursuing a lot of identity politics-driven initiatives, which are outside the remit of the core remit of the National Trust, which is meant to be focusing on those heritage conservation activities. But I think there is a big governance issue there too, because in order to enable them to shift their focus onto things that are outside their core remit, the National Trust management have been dismantling democracy. They have been removing those internal checks and balances, such as the regional committees, the advisory bodies that were within the organisation, making sure that it was sticking to its to its founding principles.
Is it fair to say they're stifling free speech and debate around National Trust issues?
Well, I think something that a lot of critics have noticed, including myself, is that whenever anyone tries to make a fair point surrounding good governance, democracy, those sorts of issues, the National Trust management really want to trample, they want to squash any criticism, and they throw lots of red herrings. They set up straw man arguments. There is a lot of deflection from the main issues that are at the heart of the problems.
Yeah, and I look at all of these institutions. I mean, I would just like to spend a day at the weekend without having identity politics and critical race theory and all of these bizarre schools of thought shoved down my throat. So people out there will be asking the question that runs through this show every evening, which is, instead of just complaining about things, how do we fix this? What do we need to do to get an institution like the National Trust back on track?
Well, I think we have to go one step back and consider why these institutions, it's not just the National Trust, are going down this path. And often it's because of the financial incentives provided to them by the funding bodies, by the state funding bodies such as Arts Council England, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and a lot of the funding bodies on which these organisations rely. So if these tick box identity politics driven, if those conditions are there, that if you tick this box, you get more funding, then of course the institutions are going to try and tick that box. So I think those funding incentives, those financial incentives need to be removed.
So essentially, it's the ecosystem around the National Trust. It's the funding councils, the research bodies, the unelected kind of quangos that basically need to be reformed, taken on, kind of reshaped so that they can be reminded as to what they should be doing in the first place. Is that fair to say?
I think that's right. Very fair. And these funding bodies are meant to be ensuring that the institutions can do their job. But the ironic thing is that they're helping derail the institutions.
Well, I can tell you, if they're going to continue to raise membership fees and charge this amount of money to shove woke ideology down people's throats, I don't think I'll be taking up a membership anytime soon. Thank you, Saditu. Do make sure you follow Saditu on X. She's the country's leading researcher on National Trust issues. Now, in a moment, as the BBC claims that mass immigration is saving the National Health Service, of course it is, I will be speaking to one man who is a little bit sceptical of these claims, not just a top surgeon, not just an expert on the NHS, also happens to be my uncle. See you in a couple of minutes.
Hello there, good evening. Welcome to your GB News weather update from the Met Office. As we head into tomorrow, I'm afraid to say there is going to be less sunshine around, more cloudy skies, also some showers at times, but still remaining rather warm for the time of year. And it's all because we have low pressure moving in from the Atlantic, dragging in some frontal systems, so some more cloud and some outbreaks of rain. And we'll see that change as we head through into this evening. So much of northern England, parts of Wales and the southwest will see quite a lot of low cloud, so some murky conditions at times, some outbreaks of rain, but still staying relatively clear across parts of the southeast and then later on across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. So turning a little bit chillier here with some patchy frost, but most towns and cities seeing a milder night if you compare it to recent nights. Then across Scotland, first thing, there's going to be a few clearer skies, still feeling chilly, largely dry, though we can't rule out a few showers just skirting the far north. And similar across Northern Ireland, brighter, perhaps with a bit more cloud across eastern areas. But for northern parts of England, parts of Wales and also the southwest, a lot of low clouds, so a murky start and quite damp at times with some outbreaks of rain. But East Anglia, Sussex and Kent likely to see a bright but chilly start to the day. Now we are going to see those cloudy skies continuing across much of the country. Still some outbreaks of rain at times. The best of the brightness still across parts of the southeast and then later on across parts of Scotland. So that's where we should see some sunshine. But for many, it is going to be a much cloudier day, but still feeling warm. Temperatures still widely above average. So highs of 15, possibly even 16 Celsius across the southeast. Then through on to Saturday, there'll be some cloud and some wet weather to start across Scotland, parts of the southwest. But through the course of the day, we'll see high pressure building back in. So once again, lots of dry weather around and lots of sunshine too. And temperatures still above average for the time of year, so still feeling pleasant. As we head into next week, more dry weather, more sunshine, but we'll see temperatures dip away. So some cold days and some cold nights ahead.
This is Britain's Newsroom, where your voice matters.
It's just astonishing. With expert analysis and honest opinion, we don't just keep you informed.
We bring you unique perspectives you won't see anywhere else.
Can't argue with any of that. When the news happens, it happens here.
On Britain's Newsroom, weekdays from 9:30 a.m.
Only on GB News.
Join me, Nana Akua, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, Dave.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Headliners on GB News 11 p.m. every night. It's got 3 top comedians going through the next day's newspapers so you don't have to read them, which is great.
That's a good point. He's lying. I mean, maybe he's not lying.
That's Headliners every night from 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. as well on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to State of the Nation tonight on GB News with me, Matt Goodwin. Now, in its typical out-of-touch fashion, the BBC has claimed, out of nowhere, that mass immigration is saving the National Health Service from a crisis. Now, you can see what you will have seen on the BBC website this week, not particularly a story that seems to have any relevance to anything going on other than the BBC wanting to tell us that migrant workers are saving the NHS. Now, there's no doubt that we do use foreign workers to fill gaps in the NHS. Of course we do. But what is this narrative that is being imposed on us? Arguably, it misses many things. Not only the fact that migration adds a huge demand problem to the NHS. Remember those government forecasts, about 10 million people coming into the country still between today and 2047. Enormous numbers of people still forecast to come into the country. But there are also serious questions about the quality of talent that we are recruiting into the NHS. Now, one man who has tried to sound the alarm on this in the newspapers is the writer and former surgeon Marion Thomas, who joins us in the studio tonight. He also, I should say, happens to be my uncle, as well as my panel contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and assistant comment editor at The Telegraph, Poppy Coburn. Marion, you've written about the pressures facing the NHS, but more importantly, you've raised the question about who we are actually bringing in to work within the National Health Service.
Correct. So in 2024, we trained just over 9,000 students in this country.
British students.
British students.
Yep.
But students are trained in the UK. And also in the same year, we imported more than 19,000 doctors from abroad, mostly from low-income countries, mostly from India, Pakistan, Egypt, Nigeria, Bangladesh even. And my grouse has been this exam called PLAB, Professional Linguistics and Assessment Board exam, which I think is not fit for purpose.
This is the exam that doctors do to become doctors?
No, the people from abroad are already qualified in their own country.
Yeah.
But as we know, there's a huge problem with corruption in medical schools in India and Pakistan, for example. You've just got to put that into your Google search and up they will come. So when they come to this country, we should discriminate the excellent from the good from the bad. And we should... We have an exam called PLAB, Professional Linguistic and Assessment Board exam, and I think that exam is not fit for purpose. For example, we know that the pass rate should be increased by about 30% to reach equivalence with British medical students.
So what you're saying is the people who are coming in, who the BBC are saying, look, aren't these people wonderful, they're saving the NHS, in some cases, or indeed many cases, they're often not as qualified or as experienced as their British counterparts. And at the same time, we're not actually allowing more British kids to enter medical school because we're capping the places.
That's absolutely. I'm not saying all the doctors coming in from abroad, but a proportion, yes. And my other problem is they come in from these countries and they've had no experience of our culture. They've got absolutely no experience of working in the NHS. And what induction do they get to work in a totally alien system? That's what I really worry about as well.
Michael Walker, the numbers are really mind-boggling. 9,000 British kids going into medical school. We're importing 19,000. Why on earth aren't we just lifting the cap and training more British kids?
I think it's important to say that both of these things can be true. Right?
Sure, but why aren't we allowing...
Well, I don't know. We should do. We should. I mean, it sounds to me like the state trying to save money, right? So it can be the case that immigrants are sort of saving the NHS. I think it would collapse if we didn't have so many people coming here. But it's also the case that in an ideal world, we would be training enough people ourselves. Now, this, to me, sounds like it was probably our government trying to skimp and save. So we should be investing more in medical students. But while we don't do that, thank God there are migrants coming here, because otherwise the NHS would collapse.
Yeah, Poppy, I mean, looking at the recent immigration numbers, we're often told, the BBC and others, well, all of the people coming in are coming in to work in the NHS. But actually, if you look at the visas, I think I'm right in saying that only around 1-2% of people who were coming in recently were coming in to be doctors in the NHS and so on. I mean, this narrative, you know, the BBC just out of nowhere kind of pushing this worldview, it doesn't seem to be journalism in a traditional sense.
I mean, I think there is actually a trend in society where immigration, and this is true for the NHS, it's basically used as a sticking plaster for a system that no longer works. And rather than admitting as a society that that system is no longer functional, cannot produce outcomes that are beneficial to either the consumers or the people who are actually working within the system, they go, well, that's too difficult and that might upset people. So instead what we're going to do is import people from different countries and hope that that fixes the problem. So we've done it with teaching, we've done it with the NHS, we've done it with local government procurement, we've done it to deal with an ageing population. Do I actually think it's made any of these things better? No. Do I think it's degraded the service? Yes. Do I think it's made the lives of politicians easier? Also, yes. So I think there is a deeper trend here that is just not being acknowledged.
It's just, Maureen, a lot of people looking for easy answers and turning to mass immigration to try and plug the holes. I mean, just go back to this question I asked Michael Walker. 9,000 British kids going into medical schools. I assume lots of British kids are rejected from medical schools every year, despite having the grades, despite having the ambition and the determination. Why on earth don't we just say, well, let's double the number of British kids going into medical schools?
Because successive governments have realised it's cheaper to import than to train. It's as simple as that, Matt. You know, there was a cap for years on medical school training places at about 7,500. This year's gone up to 9,300 or thereabouts. And the reason for that is the 5 new medical schools that Jeremy Hunt commissioned in 2018. They're just coming into service and starting to produce graduates. That's why it's gone up to 9,300. But there are no medical schools being commissioned. The number of medical school places are full. They can't take any more. So I think it'll plateau now at about under 10,000.
So what do we do then if over the next 22 years, Michael, we have another 10 million people coming in according to the government's own forecast? And if Marion Thomas is right, they're also potentially going to be entering an NHS where we have doctors, we have healthcare professionals who are not trained to the same level as their British counterparts.
It seems to me like you're kind of conflating two issues there. I mean, I don't know why the sort of qualification of the NHS sort of matters when you're talking about how many people come in.
Well, the NHS is going to come under much greater pressure in the next few years than it hasn't already.
Well, I mean, the main reason it's going to come under a lot of pressure is because we have a massively ageing population. Like, the big crisis which is facing our NHS is the fact that the working age population is shrinking in proportion to retirees. Who, one, aren't working because they worked hard all their life, but two, are much more likely to need intensive healthcare. So, in fact, it is mass migration, which is kind of the government's solution to the fact that we're not having many kids and we're going to have a very ageing population.
It's a Ponzi scheme.
Now, again, you could have a different solution, but that's...
I do have a different solution. There's this country that's very rich. People are saying it's going to be their next century, China. It's now the #1 developer, buyer and researcher of robotics in the world. That's what they're betting on to deal with their ageing population problem permanently. Japan's doing the same thing. We're betting on a Ponzi scheme. They're betting on technological advances. Who do you think is going to win?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean,
I don't think it's difficult to say. I think it's certainly not going to be Britain, is it? But let's hold that thought, Michael Walker. Thank you to Marion Thomas, our guest in the panel. Now, up next, Patrick Christis. Patrick, what have you got on your show this evening?
Well, loads of breaking in the last few hours, actually. Puberty blockers for kids are back. We're going to blow the lid off that total scandal. I'm also going to be joined by an actor with dwarfism who is furious about the new Snow White Disney movie. There's also, I think, a Labour backbench revolt brewing, so I'm going to tell you exactly why. Is it ever OK to smack your child? There's a new report out which, shock horror, says that it absolutely isn't, but we'll talk about that. And what is going on with reform, Matt? It does appear like there might be a little bit of trouble at mill. I think for a lot of my viewers and listeners, they will be hoping that there is not an implosion on the cards there, but we'll have to wait and see.
Well, splendid stuff, Patrick. That's all coming up now on State of the Nation here with me, Matt Goodwin. After the weather, do stick around for Patrick Christis. I'm going to be back next week. Join me on Wednesday, 8 p.m. It's been great to have you with us right here on State of the Nation. Stick around. Patrick will be with you in just a couple of minutes.
Even though we'll see a cloudy start, it'll be a bright outlook for the rest of the day. Boxed Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, good evening. Welcome to your GB News weather update from the Met Office. As we head into tomorrow, I'm afraid to say there is going to be less sunshine around, more cloudy skies, also some showers at times, but still remaining rather warm for the time of year. And it's all because we have low pressure moving in from the Atlantic, dragging in some frontal systems, so some more cloud and some outbreaks of rain. And we'll see that change as we head through into this evening. So much of northern England, parts of Wales and the southwest will see quite a lot of low cloud, so some murky conditions at times, some outbreaks of rain, but still staying relatively clear across parts of the southeast and then later on across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. So turning a little bit chillier here with some patchy frost, but most towns and cities seeing a milder night if you compare it to recent nights. Then across Scotland, first thing, there's